Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on.
Problem House by Dark Phoenix. A couple of years ago, the house my sister was living in became something of a problem. She would hear footsteps from the floor above, when the family knew that no one was up there. They would see shadowy forms out of the corner of their eyes, and they would constantly have the strong feeling of dread, no matter what room of the house they were in. This creepy feeling actually increased over time as the happenings became much more frequent and much more ominous. Ghostly knocking and voices became the norm, and literally it was a daily occurrence. The shadows became more defined and would literally sit in dark corners and watch a room's occupants for extended periods of time. They all began to avoid parts of the house where activity seemed to pick up in intensity when they were in it. Then there were two very strange and terrifying occurrences, and that really shook everyone up. The first happened to my brother one night when he went to stay. He decided to sleep on their couch instead of in the guest room, since the living room had become something of a hotspot in recent times. He awoke suddenly in the middle of the night and became aware of a black figure in the room that was darker than the night around it. It paced the room soundlessly for a short period of time, and then it seemed to crawl up a wall and melt into the ceiling above. The area, when he examined it in the morning, was approximately where our sister's room was, just one floor above. The second thing happened a few weeks later. My sister was asleep in her bed when she felt the mattress shift and sink, as if someone had sat down beside her. She sat up and began to say the Lord's Prayer while she reached for a small bottle of holy water that she had gotten. She daubed the four corners of the bed and commanded the spirit to leave her in peace. And what happened next terrified her so much, she called both my brother and I in the middle of the night. As she commanded the spirit to depart, she suddenly heard a growl that chilled her blood. Then the bed began to shake violently while the growling continued. This lasted for about 30 seconds and then just suddenly stopped. At this point, she turned on the lights, called us frantically, and dressed to leave immediately. She made arrangements to have the house blessed, but it turns out that such things sometimes have to be scheduled several weeks in advance, and that was much to all of our surprise. During the waiting period, a local ghost hunting group heard about the house and asked to do an investigation, and seeing as how she didn't have any other means of addressing the problem, she agreed. The group did a 6-hour walk-through investigation, followed by another 6 where the recorders and cameras were left to run in the empty house. While they caught nothing on video and still cameras, the audio was described to me as one of the most chilling 12 hours of audio they'd ever experienced. They tallied no fewer than 5 different voices speaking during the entire length, the majority being female. There were a lot of things that they could not figure out a source from, mainly in the vein of things being moved or bangs and crashes. The final voice was what they pegged as male, but even the lead investigator said he had never heard such a deep and terrifying male voice. While some of the female voices could be understood, the male voice was unintelligible and consisted of raspy words and growls. The final nail in the coffin on the audio occurred during the part where no one was in the house. At some time around 4 a.m, madness seemed to have broken out in the place. For a stretch of about 10 minutes, 2 separate audio recorders captured what I will describe as a temper tantrum. The stretch began with voices talking to one another in an agitated state, and then you could clearly hear loud footsteps going up the stairs, followed by a series of booms and crashes, as if someone was taking the house apart, maybe looking for something. Then it went quiet for a moment, and female voices began to murmur to one another. Then there was a large explosion of sound as whatever went up the stairs came running back down, even louder than before. The female voices totally shut down, and a very distinct growling could be heard. Then there was another loud crash. It sounded like the table where the recorder was placed had been overturned, and you could hear the recorder bouncing on the wood. The sequence ends with the basement door being opened violently and what sounds like something scuttling down the stairs. Not human footsteps, but something going on more than 2 legs. Then everything stopped, and the house was silent until the team returned and turned off their equipment. Needless to say, my sister went to her church and told them about this. The house blessing and cleansing was done within days. Long story short, they had to do it twice, as the priest said he still felt the presence fighting back as he was blessing the house during round 1. The second time seemed effective, and the house was quiet for a couple of months. But unfortunately, the process began again. This time, my sister opted to move out instead of going through the whole thing again. She also suspected that a roommate might have been dabbling in something dark and might have been actively calling it back. The last I heard of the place after my sister moved out was that things were escalating back to where they had been before the blessing. Obviously, something very evil is in that place. Why I'm a Believer by East Coast Woods. I used to say people that spoke of ghosts and that sort of thing were 1 or 2 brain cells shy of a light, but that was before an evening that I spent at my old fire station, one of many nights I spent there. The place was notorious for stories of haunting and ghostly encounters, though I didn't really believe those stories, feeling they were made up to scare the younger fire and rescue personnel. One evening we were doing the standard late-night thing at the station. 4 of us were laying in our bunks, watching TV and swapping stories. It was about midnight or so when we heard the front entrance doorway open and close. This was a large steel door, and all of the department members had a key, so there was nothing strange about that, and our conversation continued. Soon after the front door had shut, we heard 2 females, one of whom was trying to calm the other one down, and the second crying hysterically. We heard them walk past the bunk room door, then heard them enter the ladies' restroom. The door shut, and the fan in the restroom came on, which it did automatically when the light was switched on. Kidding back and forth, one of the firemen said, "One of the rescue women must have gotten her heart broken or something," and we all kind of chuckled a bit and continued our conversation. Next thing we knew, one of the women started screaming. I mean, it was the worst scream I had ever heard in my life. A scream of true fear and pain. We all sprung from our beds, throwing our bunker pants on as we hit the hallway on our way to the ladies' room. As we approached the door, we could hear the crying and calming voice at the same time, and I vividly remember seeing the light on under the bathroom door, and I knew the fan was on because I could hear it. One of the other guys knocked loudly on the door, and both the crying and calming voices immediately stopped. Then the toilet flushed. Bill knocked on the door again, and there was no reply. All was perfectly quiet. Bill opened the door. The bathroom light was still on and the toilet was refilling, but no one was in the bathroom. Keep in mind, the only way out is through the door. There were no windows or any other way out. Bill's immediate reply was, "This is bullshit." He instructed 2 of the guys to go through the rec room and told me to come with him. We went out the front door and stood about 10 feet from one another. I was silent, and he kept repeating that this was total bullshit. Never have I had the feelings and emotions I experienced that night. All of a sudden, we could hear the woman screaming again. It was between us, yet it sounded as though her voice was a million miles away. Seconds later, the other 2 firefighters arrived around the front where we were standing. We all went back to bed with not much discussion, but rather, I guess everyone's thoughts kept to themselves about what we had just experienced. I'd laid down on my stomach with my arm around me, which promptly fell asleep. Did I move my arm out from under me? No, I didn't move a muscle the remainder of that night. That night did forever change my beliefs, and even though I may hear some stories from time to time and I think they're questionable, never will I say someone is absolutely not telling the truth, ever again. Alien Encounter, submitted by Ron Ray. This took place between 1989 and 1997. Many things occurred over this period of time, and other things happened before this. It's a long story. Forgive me for taking up so much space, but I feel it necessary to explain the entire sequence of events. If it's too long to read, I certainly understand and don't blame you for going on to another story. The time surrounding this particular series of events began around July 1989. This is not to say that July 1989 was the first time I had paranormal activities in my life, but the things that I'm about to convey to you now began around that time. And although the things that I'm posting happened over a long period of time, I feel they are related, or I would not have placed them here. It began with an evening out at an American Legion post in Guntersville, Alabama. I had gone out with my brother and his 12-year-old son to the local American Legion post, where they were holding dart-throwing contests. Not actual tournaments, but just open games where anyone could enter the competition. After an evening of mediocre games at best, we felt it was time to get back to his house so that his son could get ready for school the next day. Also, the American Legion closed at 10 p.m., so there was actually no other choice. We left the Legion around 10:05 and made a quick stop at a convenience store. After that, we drove to his house, which was approximately 8 miles away. He lived in a rural area that is very sparsely populated, and the road to his house had no houses for miles. About halfway there, we stopped to use the bathroom, which is something most country boys in Alabama do without even thinking twice. The bathroom consisted of a patch of weeds on the side of the road with no traffic. Anyway, I add this bit of information only to establish a relative time frame for the trip from the Legion to his house. The trip, including the stops at the convenience store and the weeds, should have taken no longer than a half hour at most. I went back over the route the next day and it took less than 25 minutes. When we arrived at his house, his wife came out and asked why we were so late. We didn't understand what she meant until she said it was after 12:30 in the morning. We both said that was impossible until we checked our watches. She was right. Not really understanding any of this, I departed and went home. The next morning, as I was putting my socks on, I noticed a pink scar on the inside of my ankle about the size of a small pencil eraser. I looked at the other ankle and there was another one, identical to the first in shape and size and location, except it was on the opposite foot. The marks looked like scars, but I had never seen them before. They appeared like two small gouges of skin had been scooped out and now had healed over, although they were not there before, I am sure of that. The marks were approximately 6 millimeters in diameter and 2 millimeters deep. They were cup-shaped. This, along with the time missing on the night before, really had me wondering what the hell was going on. I immediately got in my car and retraced our trip from the night before, stopping at both the store and the side of the road where we took a piss. I was reenacting everything we had done the night before, and there was no way the trip could have taken over 25 minutes. But it was evident that over 90 minutes of our lives were missing, not including the stops and actual drive time. I went over all the details with my brother, his wife, and his son, and there was no deviation in accounts of the trip and times of the event. This was perplexing, but there was nothing we could do about it. At the time, there was no reason to do anything, but a few nights later, I had a very vivid dream of 3 tall beings who I thought were doctors who were standing over me, examining me, and several smaller things were watching off to the side. I was on a metal table with platforms on my sides, so my arms were outstretched at 90 degrees, like a flat metal cross. There was a table of sorts to the right of my head, and I was lying on my back, and all 3 tall doctors or whatever were to my right, while there were several shorter, darker beings seated behind a small 2-foot-high wall to my left. There was a strong light above me, but I couldn't actually see a light. One of the tall ones to my right said, as if instructing the smaller ones, "This would normally be terminal." And that's all I can remember of that. Fast forward a couple of months. I found a beautiful house for rent on a bluff overlooking several miles of the Tennessee River, north of Guntersville, Alabama. The house was beautiful, but very isolated. There were only a few houses within a quarter of a mile, honestly like 3. It was about 1/8 of a mile down to a little gravel drive that dead-ended at the house, and there was nothing around the house but woods and a cliff overlooking the river. The house had not been occupied for a long time, which I found strange because of its beauty and location, but there was a little work that was required to get it up to code. The view of the Tennessee River was blocked by several small to medium trees that had grown up between the backyard and the bluffs. One of the first things I did was start clearing those trees so we could see the river from the second-floor deck. As I cut one of the wild cherry trees, it was evidently in a bind and I didn't realize it. When I made the first cut after it fell to the ground, the trunk sprang back and struck me in the chest, and I was knocked to the ground almost unconscious. Immediately upon getting back up, I realized that the impact with the tree trunk had broken some ribs on my left side. I went to the doctor, who confirmed that I did have 2 broken ribs over my heart, about an inch to the left of my nipple. He also said because of this, I would get pneumonia, and when I asked why, he said that because I was a smoker, I would favor those ribs and not cough, causing a buildup of phlegm in my lungs, and therefore causing pneumonia. I then saw that he was right, because I hadn't coughed much since the accident. Look, I know this is dragging, but I promise there's a purpose to everything I'm talking about. Because of what the doctor said, I had to force myself to cough after that. The night after the doctor visit, I was asleep in my recliner in the living room. I couldn't bear the pain to lie flat in bed, and I awoke in the middle of the night and went to the bathroom. On the way there, a loud sound scared me so bad I jumped at least 4 feet in the air. The sound was like in the movies when a spaceship takes off. It was a whirring sound, just for a few seconds, and then it faded off and then went straight up. It was pleasant outside, so the windows were open, and I first wondered if I had just been dreaming, but my dogs were barking outside telling me that it wasn't a dream. The dogs had heard the same sound. After composing myself, I finally got to the bathroom to complete the mission that woke me up to begin with. Standing there, I knew I had to cough, so I prepared myself in the now familiar fashion of folding my arms around my chest and braced for the excruciating pain. I coughed. No pain. I coughed again. No pain. This was wonderful. I must have coughed 20 times. As soon as the elation died down, I began to wonder why there was no pain. I looked down and saw a small hole that was burned into my shirt, directly over where my broken ribs had been. I had always carried a pen in that pocket, and upon further inspection, I found that the burn had gone through my shirt pocket and into the Pilot V pen. Not all the way through the pen, but deep enough that I wondered why it wasn't leaking. I still have that Pilot V pen with the melted spot on it. I don't know what healed me, but it did. It mended my ribs. I was now healed. After that healing encounter, strange things began happening on a regular basis. My wife and children witnessed many events that, had I not been there, I would have had a hard time believing. Once my daughter said that there were men outside of her window, which was on the ground floor. They had flashlights that shone through the curtains and into her room. This room overlooked the bluffs. There were never any people around that house. I know that for a fact. But my 8-year-old son also said that little men led him out during the night and showed him their spaceship. He actually drew a ship that he said was in the front yard. He said that as they were leading him out, I was sitting in my chair as if in a trance. My eyes were open, but I didn't react to him and help him as the beings led him outside. One time I found him outside asleep on the floor by an open door downstairs. My wife dreamed that beings other than human transported her to another place, and I would regularly dream of interaction with aliens. I set up a mini tape recorder that used the small cassette tapes before the time of solid-state memory. I set it on voice actuated so that it would automatically record when a sound activated it. The next morning when I checked it, there was a strange noise at the beginning, kind of like dishes breaking, and then 60 minutes of white noise. I tested it over and over, and it always turned on when there was no sound. We began seeing lights outside at night. The lights would travel at a very slow speed, very fast speeds with no sound. These lights were within a 3 to 5 mile radius over and inside the Tennessee River below. Approximately 5 miles across the river below us was another mountain, the same height as the one we lived on. It was on these mountains and their slopes where the lights occurred. On the mountain directly across the river was a small town and community called Fife. This is in a different county from the one we lived in, but we could see the activity from our mountainside. Anyway, it's about 5 to 7 miles from the house that we were in, as the crow or UFO flies, as it were. So we could see some activity that they couldn't, because it was on the slopes or in and around the river. I watched some of those lights go down to the river and then beneath the water, and you could see a dim light when they went under, but sometimes they would come out and sometimes the lights would disappear. One morning, after a real busy night of light activity, There was an Army helicopter that came up the bluffs as if searching for something, and when it got within 100 yards or so, we could see right inside it because it was at the same level of our house. And there were men inside, and they were soldiers, and they acted like we weren't even there. And that was all about that. After that, the local television station started reporting people seeing a black helicopter right before several cow mutilations. This happened several times, but I don't know whatever became of that. People that visit us would say they could feel a difference at our house. When things got quiet at night, I could hear an extremely low-pitched rumble that sounded like a bulldozer, but like it was underground. There were flocks of hummingbirds. One even built a nest right by the second-floor deck that we always spent time on, and I watched as she raised 2 little babies. And there were also hundreds of bats that roosted in our attic. In the evening, they would dive out of the attic, above the sliding glass door so we could count them, and they would just fly into the surrounding woods. It seemed that all these types of wildlife, including spiders and scorpions, were drawn to this house. This activity continued for several years until I finally moved out in 1997. It was a combination of my deteriorating health and, sadly, my deteriorating family. I really can't remember everything, but I know there was a lot more to this story. I mean, a lot more. Sadly, since then, my home has dissolved. My daughter joined the Air Force and has refused to come home. My son began to get straight F's at school and dropped out, and sadly, I don't know where he is now. My wife left me and now lives in a different state. There is something hanging above all of our heads that haunts our memories and our dreams, and it has destroyed my family and has almost physically destroyed me. I once considered hypnosis to quit smoking, but refused for fear of remembering things that I don't want to know. I'm sure that if my son, daughter, or wife were here, they would say, "You're not telling half of what happened." But this is all I can tell for now. It's more than I've been able to talk about for many, many years. Old housing. In our high school years in the mid-1980s, my best friend and I used to have a game we played called Old Housing. The game was to drive out into the country at night, find an old farmhouse or old building that hadn't been lived in for some time, and just kind of explore around. I will admit this game usually involved some other substances being utilized to make the adventures a little more interesting, usually of the herbal variety. The point of the game was to see who could scare the shit out of the other the most. After a long winter of not old housing, trying too hard to get through deep snow while stoned to get to a building that had too much snow in front of it to get into, we decided to give it a go again. We were way out in the country when we happened across an old farmstead we had never seen before. The house looked perfect for an adventure, so away we went. We pulled between the house and the barn and proceeded to enter the house through the back door. For some reason we were always sneaky and just trying to be quiet, trying to make very little noise when we did this. Like maybe the people that didn't live there anymore might hear us, right? Immediately in this house, we knew something was wrong. We had entered through what was the kitchen, and without either of us trying to creep the other out, we were both on edge and had that some kind of weird feeling going on. In this particular instance, no alternative substances other than a couple of beers had been imbibed. We both tried to shrug it off, but the feeling just wouldn't go away. We walked from the kitchen into the living area of the house. And there was a stairway to the second floor to the left, but neither of us wanted to go any farther into that house. I started to walk back out into the kitchen, and my buddy was close on my heels. We were both trying to figure out why this house had us on edge. At this point, for some reason, I noticed the clock on the kitchen wall was still ticking. And then it dawned on me. This was not an old abandoned farmhouse. This was still an old but lived-in farmhouse, and we had just snuck in the back door of someone's home in the middle of the night. Fortunately, my buddy had seen the clock about the same time I did, and he put the pieces together also. I don't actually remember opening the back door or getting back into the truck, but I know we got out of there in record time. After a number of holy shits and much more loud discussion on how we were just in someone's house and could have been shot, we formally decided to end our adventures of old housing. The cats. Living in base housing during my time in Guam, my wife was into cats and we had gotten 2 from an animal shelter. About a week later, the wife called me while I was at work and she was freaking out. I couldn't understand what she was trying to tell me, so I asked the boss if I could go check on her. I got to the house and she was sitting outside crying. After calming her down, I finally got the story out. She put these cats in the spare bedroom so she can mop the floors. But the trouble was, every time she turned around, both cats would be sitting behind her staring at her. Okay, I thought maybe she didn't latch the door. But no, she said that she had done it 3 times. The last time just making sure the door was latched, and using a chair under the knob to make sure the door stayed closed. Enter the dutiful husband. I went in the house and checked the spare room. No other way out but the back door. So I checked the door. It closed securely. I put the cats in that room and closed the door, walked down the hall into the living room, and turned around. The cats were in the hallway staring at me. I went back and checked the door, and it was still shut. So I'm now freaked out, and wife won't even come in the house. I put the cats in our bedroom, and that was fine. I tried one more time in that spare room, but when I walked backwards down the hall, keeping an eye on the door, I got to the living room, and those cats were in the middle of the floor staring at me. I took those damn cats back to the animal shelter, and we moved off base. Home Invaders by Hume. The story happened when I was 12 years old. I'm a female and 25. The story I'm about to tell you might not be scary to most, but for me and my parents, it was. I remember it was a Saturday night around 9 or 10 during summertime. I owned one dog at the time. His name is Benny. My parents decided that night that they felt like going for a walk around the block, walking Benny and asking me whether I wanted to join them. I said no because I wanted to play PWI on my PC. My parents were okay with leaving me alone since the walk wouldn't take longer than 30 minutes tops. As my parents would get dressed to leave the house, I logged into PWI and looked around in my guild and global chat to see if anyone was on. For some reason, no one was, so I decided to join my parents. I got dressed, I put Benny on his leash, and we all left. I'd like to mention that I lived in an apartment building that had 10 floors, and we lived on the very first floor. I'm not sure how to explain it, but you have the basement of the building and then the first row of apartments. Basically, you enter the building and are already facing the apartments. I lived in the very first one. I remember always hating that because whoever would pass by our door, we would hear them at any time of the day or night. Whoever was lurking at night, we would hear them. It was somewhat eerie to live on floor 0. Anyway, we left the house and my dad closed the door. We had 3 keyholes and a steel bar that would block the door from the inside. The bar covered half the door. Precautions were my father's obsession. We left the building and enjoyed our walk. After 15 minutes, we realized the wind had changed from warm summer wind to incoming storm wind. My mom makes the call to go back home, as Benny already did his duties, so we went back. We opened the building door, climbed the 5 stairs to our door and attempt to open it. And my father does the following: unlocks the first 3 locks, and then attempts to unlock the metal bar that holds the door locked. At that moment, my father pauses, turns around at us with the most serious face I've ever seen on him, and whispers to us to call the police and ring the neighbor's door. My mom went to the second apartment, and the neighbor, who I'll call Ted, come out and ask my father what happened. My dad whispered to him, covering the see-through hole of the door, "Someone is in our house, and here they are holding the door. Please stay here with my family and attempt to open it. I'll be right back." After saying that, my father rushes off all by himself around the building in the dark. I say dark because we didn't have a streetlight on that side of the building facing the block garden. My dad disappeared into the darkness, and I went outside too, not following him too much, but only to see if he was in trouble. He's my dad, don't judge me. As soon as I got out, I heard him shout, "Hey, you! Come back! Who the hell do you think you are? I called the police!" At the same time I hear him shout, I looked at Ted, who managed to open the door and enter the house. I went after them and entered my house. It no longer felt like home. In just 15 minutes while we were walking, the home invaders made a complete mess of our house. All of our shelves and wardrobes were pulled out, our clothes scattered all over the house. Benny's dry food was all over the floor, indicating they must have tripped in his bowls, probably not knowing we owned a dog. But what scared me the most was how organized they were. I say they because after seeing the disaster that was left behind, we knew it was impossible for just one person to hold the door, steal, and organize what they were going to take with them. I say organized because the thieves put into our living room, all packed and ready, what they wanted but didn't end up stealing. On the couch they placed our laptops and one of our TVs, my father's collection of coins, our phones, chargers, wallets, and even my father's camera. He's a photographer, and that week he had to attend a wedding. They didn't have enough time to steal all of it, so they just settled with some of my mom's jewelry and some pocket money. After seeing all this in my silly child mind, I rushed to my room to check my piggy bank. I always saved up money from whatever chores I did. It wasn't much, but it was my work and savings at the time, and I thought they stole it too. When I entered my room, I saw that the metal bars covering my windows had been cut open and my window broken. That's how they entered, through my room. My room is the only room facing the side of the building, and the one most secluded from views. Needless to say, I never felt safe in my own room again, which I had to live for the next 10 years of my life, until I finally moved in with my fiancée. The police arrived, and they started throwing white dust, and I have no idea what this is still, all over our house to find fingerprints. They took pictures, took our statements, analyzed my room and window. They were unable to catch the home invaders, but were able to tell us that this invasion was not the only one in our neighborhood. During that month, another 4 houses were broken into, one of them being the home of a cop. They told us that the invaders analyzed their victims, learned their schedules, and even knew where their children's rooms were, as they seemed to be entering the houses through the children's windows. All of the families affected by these guys had kids. They didn't expect us to be back that soon and panicked, hence one of them was holding the door with his body so that the others could flee. The person after which my dad was shouting was probably the one who had been holding the door and escaping last through the broken window. I don't know what could have happened if I didn't change my mind and give up on raiding for gear in PWI. I probably would have come face to face with these invaders. I'm happy I didn't, and I hope to God I never meet with them. My Parents' Haunted House by Twilight Dreamer 87. I am a 30-year-old woman, married, and recently had moved back in with my parents due to moving back to the town I grew up in. My husband and I are taking our time looking for our own place, due to wanting something nice in the area, and that's usually hard to find. The story takes place in my parents' house, starting back 10 years ago. A description of the house for a bit of content. It's a 2-story brick stone house in the city limits, but still surrounded by nothing but woods. You have to go through a garage that leads into the kitchen with the first bedroom to your left. Past the kitchen is the main living room, and to the right is the hall that is very open. In this area you will find the main dining room and second living area, but if you continue straight, you'll see the staircase to your left, and even further straight is my parents' bedroom and bathroom. Going up the stairs, you come to the third living area. Yeah, this is a huge house. It has 2 sets of French doors side by side that lead to the outside balcony. Going straight, a sharp left leads you to the 3 other bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. And this is where the story takes place. The first time I stepped foot into this house, I immediately felt off, like something just wasn't right. I felt a presence, but I didn't know what or who it was. I brushed it off thinking I was just reading too much into it. I continued to feel this way for the next couple of years, and because of this, I didn't enjoy much visiting them. Back then, my parents liked to gamble a lot, so they would ask me to babysit my baby brother and sister on the weekends. My boyfriend, now husband, loved them, so he would always babysit with me. The first few times, I really didn't pay attention to the feeling I would get because we would be busy playing or eating with the kids. After that, things kind of chilled out, and we would end up watching movies until it was time for all of us to go to bed. Now, my husband is a freak of nature. It's like he falls asleep the second his eyes are closed. Me, on the other hand, takes forever to get comfortable enough to wind my mind down. I also don't sleep well even when I do finally get to sleep. This one night was the first time I saw and heard something in this brand new house. In our room, the bed was facing the doorway, but not directly in front of it. With the double doors open, you can see the front of the staircase and all the way down the hallway. As long as the light is on, that is. On this night, only one of the hall lights was on. I was laying in bed with the TV on, but the volume down low, so I could hear it if one of the kids called me. I was almost asleep when I heard one of my siblings coming down the stairs. I opened my eyes a bit and waited for them to get to the bottom, but they never did. I didn't think anything of it, closed my eyes, and began to drift off. A few minutes later, I heard it again, so I opened my eyes and waited, but again, they never got to the bottom. This time I sat up and listened, a bit spooked, but nothing I couldn't handle. I got a bit nervous, but I still went and checked to see if they were there, and maybe if they were scared to come all the way down or something. No one was there. Confused and thinking I must be dreaming it all up, I went back to bed, this time closing one of the double doors. It was a few hours later, around 2:30, when I felt like someone was very near me, as if they were standing right next to the bed, right in front of me. Usually when I opened my eyes, I would see the green glow of the alarm clock on the bedside table, but this time I saw nothing. It was pitch black. I couldn't even see the hallway light on, and the TV had turned off on its own. I felt like I couldn't move. I was awake now and scared to the bone. I was finally able to call out my husband's name loud enough to wake him, and he reached over and turned on the light, and right then the scared feeling went away, and I was able to move. I freaked out and started crying. I couldn't begin to explain to him what happened because even if I had, he didn't believe in such things. So I told him I was having a nightmare and asked him to go check on the kids. When he came back, he said the kids were fine and got back into bed. With the light on, I was able to fall back asleep, but again, it took me forever. The next day, I told my mom about what had happened, and that's when she told me. She'd been hearing footsteps on the stairs at night and even saw someone standing by the door at times. She didn't tell anyone because she did not want to scare the kids, and this is when she told me what she had done. She wanted to know what was going on in her house, so she went and bought a voice recorder. One day, she decided to use it and went upstairs while everyone else was gone. She asked the typical questions like, "Who is here, and what do you want, and why are you here?" And then said, "You've passed away and need to go into the light. You're not welcome here." The next day, she decided to leave the recorder in one of the bedrooms upstairs while it was recording for about 4 hours while she was out running errands. I asked if she had checked it, and to my surprise, she said she was too afraid to listen to it alone. I wanted to listen to it, so off we went to the computer and began listening to it after it was uploaded. During the 4 hours she was gone, you could hear something clicking or tapping, the sounds of a drawer opening and closing, but we weren't really sure. Then we were listening to the part where she was asking questions, and now you could hear a sound that resembled a fan or maybe static throughout the whole thing, so some sounds were indistinguishable. But the one sound we did hear chilled us to the core. When she asked, "What do you want?" it gave us an answer. The answer was my brother's name, Jamie. It didn't answer any other questions except for that one. I immediately started crying. He wasn't having those night terrors for no reason. Something was there for him, every night. We soon asked a friend to cleanse the house, and for a long time everything was okay. My brother stopped having night terrors, my mom was able to sleep comfortably, and all was good again. Until now. I'd been living in this house for a month and a half, and for the last 3 weeks, I'd been seeing things everywhere, especially when I was alone. Because of this, I won't stay alone there anymore. I get the strong feeling of being watched, and I had the feeling of someone pulling on my blanket at night. I thought it was time for another cleanse. And just an FYI, I am the third generation on my mother's side of the family that is able to see spirits. My dad's side of the family has, in the past before I was born, practiced black magic. I don't like speaking to them, and I won't dabble in any of that spiritual stuff most people do. I stay as far away from it as possible, and I recommend that you do too. Even if you're careful, these spirits can haunt for a long time, even long after you're gone. Quick update. So, one day I was sitting in the living room floor playing with my nephew. My mom was on the left couch and my sister was on the right couch. My nephew had a toy piano that is made of cloth and can be folded up. This piano is behind us in the corner with all my nephew's other toys. We were talking and watching my nephew attempt to walk when the piano started making sounds. It's like someone was pressing the keys slowly. We stopped and stared and then looked at each other, shocked. Then the keys were pressed rapidly until it finally shut itself off on its own. My sister was terrified due to something happening to her last night around midnight that she didn't tell us about. Mom and I were not scared. Scary Ass Lift Ride, submitted by Terrence. This was the last time I would ever use a ride-sharing app. My roommate and I had just gotten back from a college reunion in North Carolina, and we were shot from the flight and all of the craziness of the parties and stuff we had taken part in over the past few days. Even before we landed at SeaTech, we decided to get a Lyft ride as it was 1, cheap, and 2, faster than anything else. We just wanted to get back to our place in Belltown and run out for something to eat, and then meet up with some friends for some drinks. No big parties or anything. So my roommate Alex gets his phone out, and as soon as we land, fires up the Lyft app. There was no need for a luggage run, we just had our carry-ons, and we were ready to boogie out of there and get back home. It was about 7:30 and dark, and we go out to meet our driver, who lets us know he's there. Young guy in a Ford Escape. He opens the gate, we throw our stuff in, and sit back for the ride. It's about 30 minutes, and we're looking forward to a shower, and then chilling with some buddies and ladies. At first I didn't notice, but the driver was taking surface streets. When I did notice, I asked him why we weren't getting on 5 North, and he said there was trouble on the highway and was going to skirt us around it and cut over through the Georgetown area to get back on I-5. We figured he was telling us the truth and let it slide. Big mistake. As we continued north, we got into South Park, and for those of you who don't know, it's a really, really ratty neighborhood. Alex and I were looking at each other and texting back and forth saying, "What the fuck are we doing here? This is bullshit," and so on. We hear another cell phone ring in the Escape, and the driver picks it up and says, "Yeah? I've got a fare. I can be back in like 25 minutes. Dude, I can't. Seriously." He stops talking, throws the phone down, and just mutters, "Fuck." We don't say anything, but in a couple of minutes he gets off 99 and makes a right and starts going through an industrial area before turning again. Alex asks, "Where the fuck are we going?" The guy says nothing and drives a bit more before coming to a really shitty house in a residential neighborhood and stops the car. He just says, "Hang on, you guys, I'll be right back," and hops out. We're sitting there dumbfounded and speechless. What the hell was going on? It's dark. This is not a good place to be, and I'll admit I was nervous as all hell. We sit there talking about how we know we can't just get out and look for another Lyft or Uber out here. I mean, fuck, I'm not going out there to get killed. About 5 minutes later, the driver comes running out of the house with a little duffel bag, jumps into the car, and takes off without shutting his door all the way. We hear pops from behind us and the sound of breaking glass. We're being shot at. And Alex and I yell out and duck as this fucking maniac is tearing ass away from the house and goes through a maze of streets for a few minutes. Then things got smoother. All the while, we're yelling out loud, "What the fuck are you doing? What the hell is going on?" I peek up, and we're back on 99 merging onto 599, and the driver is still silent. I'm not saying anything. I'm just texting Alex like mad, but he's not saying anything back. There was silence all the way to I-5, and now we know we're like 10 minutes from home. We're scared out of our minds, but we don't know what to do other than sit there and wait until this is all over. Finally, we got to our place. We just got out, opened the back, grabbed our shit without saying a word to the guy, and all he said was, "Sorry about that," and then drove off. I checked my phone, and we were charged for the ride, which I didn't say anything about as we ran to our place and practically dove inside. We were just sitting there like trying to catch our breath, so I got up and poured 2 Macallans neat and sat back down. I said, "We need to call the police." And Alex says, "I've been thinking about that. I don't think we should." I was like, "What the fuck, man? We almost just got killed." He was quiet for a moment and said, "Okay, say that guy gets arrested. He's obviously in deep with some shady shit, probably drugs, maybe something else. What do you think the guys he runs with are going to do when they find out? They know your name, your phone number, where you live, what you look like, and, no offense, me too." That sank in for a minute. He was right. We ended up calling our friends and telling them what happened and that we weren't going out. Lo and behold, our cool friends showed up at our place an hour later with libations and food to hang out with us. We ended up having an awesome night right in our own place, despite the scariest and frankly almost deadliest ride of our lives. I will never use Lyft or Uber or whatever else is out there, ever again. Creeper Attack, submitted by Hot Mama Judy. My story begins in Baltimore during the summer of 7th grade. I was living in the county right outside the city line, and according to most people, the safer area of Baltimore. I hadn't had the easiest life growing up, but it was definitely better than most of the kids I grew up with. I was a kid from a single-mom household only because my father died in a motorcycle accident when I was just 2 years old, so I was raised with my grandparents living in the same house just below in our in-law apartment. I was lucky to have awesome grandparents and lots of friends, so I got through the hard times easier than most of the kids around here. I had lost my pop 2 years earlier when this happened, and he was like my dad and the last of my family I had left. My mom was always more involved in my brother's needs than mine, and we didn't get along. I began to spiral into a bad place after losing the only dad I ever had, right when most girls really need them. I tried to keep being the tomboy who kicked butt and cared about nothing, but it wasn't as easy anymore because I had no one telling me I was beautiful, smart, or anything like that. I was alone now. I started drinking and smoking. I ran the streets and started kissing the boys I had always just hung out with or beat up. I was dealing with way too many things for a 13-year-old girl, and I tried to slow down and take a step back by getting into riding BMX with my friends. For my birthday, I had saved up $500 and I bought a brand new BMX, and I was determined to get good at riding it. I started riding it every morning from 5:45 and I would be out there in front of my house, but soon I got tired of being in the way of cars, so I decided to move my practice course to the local park a block away. Bright and early, I would get up, pull my bike out of the house, and ready to ride down the driveway to the park. I noticed this one day my cat was acting weird, and as I started to go down the driveway, he kept running in front of me, almost getting run over by me. He had never done this before. I should have stopped right there and then and took it as a sign, but I called him some names and rode off instead. I got to the park and noticed several people there walking around and in their cars. A nurse in scrubs and a man walking his dog were there talking along with 5 other random people enjoying the morning. I made it around the track about 2 times before I noticed that there was only one person there now. This scruffy guy had come out of the path through the woods yelling, "Here, puppy," as I rode by. It seemed fishy, so I decided to leave, but I had to go around the track to leave, and I was just about to, when all of a sudden, the man runs down the hill, grabs me by the loop of my pants, and tears me from my bike. He threw me off it like a rag doll, and I screamed, "Fire! Rape! Help!" But then I felt him grab my hair and pound my head into the concrete path. I don't remember much after that, except that when I look back, I was floating above this guy on top of me, banging my head into the concrete, watching it like I was not in my body, seeing everything from a sky view. I don't know why, but it's like I couldn't take being in my body while he hurt me, so I left it the only way I could. After he was done destroying my self-worth and innocence, I remember waking up like a tornado, being sucked back into my body. I got up, grabbed my bike, and took off as fast as I could to my house. I got to my back steps and paused to cry, and as I looked up, there was the guy in the alleyway staring at me. I ran into my house and woke my mom and called the police. They almost caught him, but he did get away. I felt like my whole life was over, and I just wanted to find a hole and be buried in it. I remember people who found out this happened saying horrible things to me like, "Well, he didn't rape you, so you should be thankful he didn't get your pants off." And some others saying, "Let this be a lesson on why you should go out alone when you're a girl." As a tomboy, I felt defeated. I went through a lifetime of bad decisions and men from this trauma, and after many years of therapy and growing up, I finally found myself again. I like to believe karma caught him quickly, and he never hurt anyone else, and if by chance he hears this, somehow he'll hear me say, "You, sir, are a coward and a giant piece of shit, and you better hope we never meet again." Mistaken Identity, submitted by Alex B. So, my story needs a bit of backstory about the area that I have been working in off and on for years now. Gallup, New Mexico is a strange town, predominantly Navajo and surrounded by reservations. Some of the people are very traditional Navajo and live way out in the middle of nowhere and are very superstitious and stick to the old ways. Others are more normal by American standards, but what I love and hate about the place is the fact that when I leave my apartment here, I usually come back with a story to tell. Another piece of info that will be relevant in this story later is that I am 6'5", muscular, bearded, and have sort of a lumberjack look. So, needless to say, I don't fit in. One evening, after a long day at work, I stopped by a grocery store to grab a few things. I'm walking through the aisles, minding my own business, when a skinny, odd-looking, balding, and middle-aged Navajo man starts hissing at me. It's hard to describe the hiss, but I will do my best. It was like he was imitating small gusts of wind with a hiss, kind of like short, sharp whoosh, whoosh. Well, this guy is hissing at me, so I just give him an odd look, but kept shopping. An aisle later, same thing. Whoosh, whoosh. I'm not kidding. This happened 2 or 3 more times in the store, and I just ignored the guy. So, I bought what I needed, and I was unloading my groceries into my truck, when I kid you not, this guy comes awkwardly running out of the store, right up to me. He didn't even check for traffic. Same thing. He looked me dead into the windows of my soul, and went whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. I was more confused than pissed, but I thought I'd take the low road, so I threw my last bag into the truck, looked at him, and angrily exclaimed, "What the fuck are you trying to say to me?" At that, he looked mortified and started backing up and shaking his head, softly saying, "No, no, no." Then he started walking in the direction of a van that had its door open, and a white lady who abandoned her groceries was walking towards me, looking concerned. I thought to myself, nope, not doing it, so I got into my truck and drove off. I'll be honest, I was thinking that maybe he was mentally handicapped and she was coming over to explain that to me. I wasn't ready to accept the fact that I may have just scared the shit out of someone like that. Years later, I'm recounting this story to some friends, one of who is from a tribe near there. I'll call my friend Ted. Ted is an Isleta Indian, and they and the Navajo share a lot of traditional beliefs, and he too had spent a lot of time in Gallup, New Mexico. Another piece of info about Ted is that his dad was a respected medicine man for the tribe and was well versed in the superstitions.
He put my mind at ease and explained that I didn't threaten a handicapped person. He explained that some of the people there believe strongly in skinwalkers, which I don't need to explain as there are many stories about them on this channel. Ted told me that as large and out of place as I was, in my work clothes and beard and blonde hair and blue eyes, well, he took it upon himself to blow his divine wind at me and get me and my evil to leave the store. The fact that I said nothing to him reinforced his beliefs, and when I finally said something, I guess it just caught him off guard and scared the hell out of him. That's just a theory, but I prefer that one over the thought that I was picking on a small, mentally handicapped guy. I thought your listeners would like this story because there are plenty of people on here claiming to have seen skinwalkers, but nobody yet has claimed to be the potential villain in someone else's story. Minji's Bed by Adicor. This happened to a friend of mine. She told me about it a year or so ago. We'll call her Minji. Minji was in her late 20s and worked as an English tutor in South Korea. One evening a few years ago, she was tutoring a high school boy, and they were up studying pretty late. The buses had stopped running. Being a long way from his house, the boy asked her if he could crash on her floor overnight and get the first bus the next morning. Minji was very reluctant because inviting a teenage male student to stay the night didn't sound like a great idea. But he was begging her, and eventually she relented. They went back to her one-room apartment, and she got into bed while he laid out a blanket on the floor, and they both fell asleep. A few hours later, at maybe 2 a.m., the boy wakes Minji up. "I'm really hungry," he said. "Well, let's go get some food." Minji opened her eyes and looked at him in disbelief. "Food? Now? It's 2 a.m. Go back to bed." But the student insisted. "No, I'm so hungry. Let's eat something now." She told him that there was some ramen in the kitchen and he could fix some himself. That didn't satisfy him. He didn't want ramen. He said, "There's a 24-hour place just down the road. Let's go there." Eventually, after several minutes of persuasion, the boy got Minji to go with him to the restaurant. So they left the apartment and started heading out. As soon as they were on the street, the boy turned to Minji and said, "I'm not hungry. I woke up in the middle of the night and looked under your bed. There's a man sleeping there." They called the police and discovered that a homeless man had been living in Minji's apartment, sleeping under her bed for over 2 months. The boy only saw him because he was lying on her floor, so he had a clear view under the bed. The police arrested the man, and thankfully there were no other issues. But that's by far the creepiest thing that's ever happened to anyone that I know.
I'm not sure what I'm dealing with. To start off, I live above my dad's workshop in a large studio apartment. My parents' house is only a few yards away, and I moved into the studio apartment when I began college. And that's when things really began to get strange. Mostly it was things being knocked over when I shut the light off to sleep. And I would pull the covers up, roll over, and hear something fall off the dresser, heavy stuff like lotion or boxes. Another time, I put in a DVD to watch before bed and walked over and shut the light off by the door. The DVD was already playing as I walked back to bed and climbed under the covers. It was a night where the moon wasn't out, so it was pitch black outside, and I distinctly remember thinking, I don't want to be in the dark. Almost instantly after I thought that, the TV shut off, and I was in the dark. I was creeped out, but tried to laugh it off like, well, the ghost must think it's time for me to go to bed, something stupid like that. I used my flashlight app to make sure I hadn't sat on a remote or anything or pulled the TV plug, and I hadn't. A while later, things picked up. This was the most that happened all at once. My boyfriend and I were laying in bed watching a movie, when all of a sudden, a box of cookies that was on the counter went flying off and skidded onto the floor. At the same time, something hit me in the back of the head. A crumpled up paper that hadn't been crumpled up before. And then the lights turned themselves on. The thing that scared me the most was when my parents went on vacation, leaving me alone. This was in 2010, and my boyfriend didn't live with me yet. I had gone to my friend's house and locked all of the doors before leaving. I came home around midnight and pulled into my long driveway and looked up to see the double doors of my studio wide open. Those doors not only are always locked, but they are never open because there is no staircase beneath them, and the doors just lead to empty air. I lived there for over a year at that point and hadn't opened them once, and when I saw them fully open, I just drove right back to my friend's house because I was too freaked out. In the morning, I went back thinking I must not have locked the door to the workshop and maybe a burglar got in. When I checked, the locks were still fully engaged and nothing had been taken from the studio apartment. In the winter, it gets really cold above the workshop, so my boyfriend and I sometimes sleep in the actual house in the spare room. Last winter, we slept there for almost 3 months. When we went back to the apartment, it just felt weird inside there. We got settled in, but both felt like there was someone watching us, and that it felt hostile, like they had taken over the room and didn't want to give it back. Another time, my boyfriend and I were trying to go to sleep when we heard faint music coming from the workshop underneath us. The weird thing was, every time we tried to listen closer, it would stop, and when we weren't trying to hear it, it would pick back up. So that's the thing that's been in the studio. It's in my parents' house, and my entire family, including my boyfriend, has seen a black, blurry shadow fly into my parents' room from the bottom of the staircase. No one knows what it is. Personally, I think they might be two separate things. The most recent thing happened just a few weeks ago. I was sleeping in the guest bedroom because my boyfriend was away, and I no longer like sleeping in the studio without him out of fear. I got up to go to work at 5 in the morning and heard someone in the library, like someone was shuffling around. I was surprised anyone else was up so early, so I looked in and saw a dark figure moving around. I didn't keep looking in case it was someone changing. My dad keeps some of his clothes in there. I asked my family when I got home from work who had been up and why. No one had been up at all. I also just get strange, creepy vibes from time to time, but not always. Like I said, I have no idea what I'm dealing with. This is a story that happened to me when I first moved out to Florida, and a scary event that took place one night. For some context, I'm a 5'6" petite female who at the time had long, dirty blonde hair that I liked to keep down. My family had just arrived to our new house a few months before this event took place, and when some of our friends heard, they asked if they could come visit for a weekend. Of course, we let them come stay with us, and decided that we should take them down to the river one night. Not far from where we lived was a large dock where lots of locals would go fishing for shrimp, crabs, and small bait. We had one time seen a man place a light in the water in order to attract a whole plethora of shrimp, and thought it would be so cool to show our friends from Utah, since there isn't anything like that up there. Being the rebellious teen that I wasn't that interested in spending time with my parents' friends, and their kids were much younger than me. So when my family left to go check out a restaurant that was nearby, I stayed behind to watch the water and look at the night sky. Everything was so peaceful and serene, but the peaceful silence was broken when a voice spoke up from the dark.
"Hey, miss,"
a male voice called out. I looked over to the lower parts of the dock and saw a man standing next to a small metal boat. It was too dark to see his face, so I have no idea what he looked like. I was too timid at the time to respond, but just by looking over in his direction was enough for him to continue.
"Are you all alone, miss? Why don't you hop into the boat with us? We will take you if you'd like," he said. Then I noticed that on the boat was a much larger man and a woman, who never spoke for the whole conversation. Now, just because I was rebellious to my parents didn't mean I was completely daft, but I was also raised to be polite, so I wasn't sure for a moment how to react. No, I'm sorry, I can't. My mom would be really mad if I did," I told him. The larger man who was on the boat put one of his feet onto the dock while the smaller man kept talking. No, it's okay. We're going to a little get-together on one of the islands. Your mom doesn't have to know. Come on, hop in." He said that and began walking up the steps. It was only then that I realized how alone I really was.
The dock was void of any fishermen because that was where the boats came in and my family had left as well. I watched him come closer, and I felt my blood run cold, not knowing what to do. But by a stroke of luck, my family came out of the restaurant and were chatting with each other. So I quickly stood and said loudly, "Sorry, looks like my family's leaving. I have to go." Before he could say anything more, I quickly sprinted away from the boat and back to my family. They hadn't seen anything and hadn't even noticed I was missing from the party when I finally caught up with them. When I looked back, I saw that the 2 men and the woman were gone along with the boat. It frightens me to think what would have happened if my parents hadn't walked out at that moment. Would those men have grabbed me and forced me onto the boat? And if they did, would anyone have heard my screams in time? I haven't gone alone to the docks ever since, and thankfully, I haven't seen that boat ever since either. First of all, I live in Murphy, North Carolina, in the center of town, and to the right of my house is a wooded area that is fenced off. I'm telling this because it may be of some importance. I'm a 31-year-old female, and on weekends I'm home alone because my 2 kids stay with my uncle, and my husband works late hours. I was coming home from my friend's house. She lives just a couple of houses up from me. It was around 8:30 in the evening when I returned home, and there are streetlights that come to about the mid part of my street and then end, and there's about a 40-foot walk in pitch darkness, and I had to enter my house from the back door because my front door was locked to keep stupid people out. Well, I was chilling on the mattress in my living room, and we moved it in here because it's cold in my house, and it's easier to move around because I have nerve damage in my foot. So I was watching some anime, then paused the episode to eat because it's hard for me to eat ramen noodles and watch TV without my glasses sliding down my nose. I just let my cat Ryu in because he was meowing frantically at the door, and as I opened it, he ran inside and I shut it. I was puzzled because I didn't know what was wrong. I just sat back down, and as I finished my food, I heard this noise on my porch. It sounded like something in between a goat and a bear cub right in front of my door, and at first I thought I was crazy, until I looked at my 3 cats, Ryu, Dottie, and Lilith, and they were looking straight at my front door, growling and hissing at the noise. And every 30 to 40 seconds, whatever it was would make that horrible noise and end with clicking sounds and thumping on the outside of my house. At this point I was terrified, and tears of fear were rolling down my cheeks. I hurriedly texted my husband at work and told him what I had heard and how the cats were reacting, and after a couple of minutes he told me to lock the front door. I was terrified of making any noise, and as I approached the door I was on my knees because I didn't want to see this thing, and as I reached to lock the door, it made that sound again. I jumped in fear and hurriedly locked the front door and then scrambled back to my bed. The sounds of thumping on the walls made me burst into tears, and I pulled my blankets close to me as I shook. And then the sound stopped, and all was silent. As my heart raced, I sat still, afraid to make the smallest sound. I thought of calling 911, but they would never believe me. I felt trapped and stalked as I stared around checking my cat's reactions. I heard this loud sound that sounded almost like a howler monkey, and as fast as it started, it stopped. Then, about 5 minutes later, I could hear it circle my house, making that sound like a goat and a bear, and it scratched and thumped on the house. By this time my chest hurt from the stress and fear. I felt this sensation like impending doom and evil. It made these goat-like sounds and returned to my porch, and for a few seconds it got louder and then it vanished. One thing I know for sure is that from the Native American part of my family, they say that a lot of things are here in the Smoky Mountains and to never look at them. I also need to say that I have been a witch ever since I was 13 years old, and I am linked also by Nordic blood in my family, and I know a few things about magic and creatures of the woods that are natural. I've grown up with them, but the sound I heard was nothing an animal would make around here. I don't know what it was, but I'm afraid it might come back to stalk me again. What I'm telling you, I know it sounds impossible, and this was my first encounter with this thing, but I swear I am telling you the honest truth. If anyone has any advice that could help me stay safe and protect my family, please let me know. Any help would be appreciated. I'm so afraid it will come for me again, or even my children. Please help. A few years ago, when my children were about 7, 5.5, and 4, they were spending the night at their dad's sister's house. Auntie Monica was babysitting that day. My then-husband and I were going to a party, and we were not going to be back until very late, so it was decided that the kids might as well just spend the night. We had only been at the party a few hours, and even though the party was nice, good food, good friends, and good music, we both felt very uneasy. Monica had babysat before, so it wasn't that we didn't trust her. There just seemed to be something off that night. So we decided to call it a night and head back to Monica's house to get the kids. We had the spare keys to the house, so we didn't knock. It was fairly late, and we didn't want to disturb anyone. When we opened the front door, we were met with a very frightened-looking Monica, a teary-eyed 7-year-old, and sleeping on the couch were our little ones. I immediately sensed something was not right, but didn't ask. We decided to spend the night too, so we moved the children to the spare bedroom. My 7-year-old would not stay in the room unless Daddy stayed with her, so we settled in with her, and I went to go talk with my sister-in-law to see what had happened. She told me that the kids had been playing in the bedroom when suddenly all 3 came running out, looking scared and crying, saying that they wanted to leave. Monica asked them what happened, but all they said was that they were scared to be there and wanted to go home. She got them to quiet down, but was not able to get them to sleep in the spare bedroom. She stayed with them in the living room until the 2 youngest fell asleep, but my oldest kept crying, saying she wanted her mommy and daddy. Monica sat with her until she calmed down. Monica says that's when my son started talking in his sleep, and my daughter soon followed. She said it was as if they were carrying on a conversation, but she couldn't understand everything they were saying. Monica says it got to the point where their voices were raised and they were almost yelling, so she went to get them to calm down, and said she put her hand on my son's chest, and he started lifting his chest like he was trying to get up, even though she wasn't holding him down. It just seemed like something or someone was holding him down. She started praying, and just as fast as it started, it all stopped, and my children went back to sleeping quietly. She told me that she could swear they were both speaking a different language, or a mixture of different languages. It scared me a little to hear this, but nothing compared to how freaked out she was. The next morning, my kids were being their normal selves, and I decided to wait until we got home to ask questions. All I got out of my oldest daughter was that they were playing in the room, and there was a voice that yelled at them and told them to get out. I asked her where the voice was coming from, and she said all she knew was that the voice was coming from inside the room with them. I tried to get more out of her, but my husband told me to stop and let her forget what had happened. About 2 years after that room was turned into a nursery for Monica's newborn daughter. The baby did not sleep there for long. They heard her crying one day, and when they walked into the room, the baby was laying on the floor next to the door. I mean, we're talking about a 2 or 3 month old baby. Even more weird, Monica had to constantly open windows and doors in that bedroom because it always smelled like mold, even though there wasn't any. I went in there a couple of times after the baby was born, and to me it smelled like something was rotting. Any ideas what happened to my 2 young children? Why they were speaking to each other while asleep? And in an unknown language? This happened when I was 11. I was living in the U.S. at the time with my parents. We had bought a nice big house in a nice neighborhood, giant backyard and all. We'd been living at this particular house for about 6 months, so we'd well and truly settled into the place. Got my first dog and everything. As a kid, this was a real highlight in my life. One day when I came home from school, my mom took me aside as soon as I had arrived home. She needed to tell me something, so sat me down. Turns out when my dad arrived home from work, he noticed one of our garden chairs had been taken from our back garden and brought around to one of the side windows at the front, which happened to be my parents' bedroom window. After checking it out, someone had removed about half of the ceiling that held the window in its frame, and with the chair still at the scene, it was concluded that whoever it was got spooked, likely by my dad getting up in the night, and whoever it was took off. Pretty scary stuff, knowing that someone had tried to get into one of our windows. Not even an open or unlocked window at that. This motherfucker tried to take the actual window out. When it came to things like this, my mom had a great way of speaking to me like an adult without scaring me, so while I was cautious, I wasn't too worried. She ended up taking a few new hobbies, though, like meeting me off the bus and checking on me in the middle of the night. I'm an only child and was a pretty independent kid, so this was a bit strange, but I understood her reasoning. We figured it was an attempt at petty theft, so left it at that. Besides, what could really happen? My dad was a pretty big dude, and I had this awesome new guard dog. I felt safe. Over the course of the next few weeks, a few of our neighbors were broken into and burglarized in amongst a few attempts at our house. So we had a thief on our hands. In that time, my dad stepped up home security, a few motion lights here and an extra lock there. About a week passed before it happened again. My mom could hear someone walking around outside of the house, so she crept up and tried to take a look. She couldn't see anything, so went about the house looking through each window. She knew someone was there, but she just couldn't catch a glimpse of him. This was the catalyst that started a month from hell. In order to keep this from getting too long, I'll summarize what happened up until the night we caught this prick. My mom became a wreck. She moved herself into the spare room at the front of the house so she could see out of a bigger window and be nearer to my room. Sometimes she'd sleep in the living room because you could see both the living room and kitchen windows. She always had a golf club with her. She lost a lot of sleep, and her work suffered. During this time, my dad wasn't exactly the hero we'd all expect. He was a dead-heavy sleeper and chalked it all up to my mom being paranoid. One evening, when she could hear the creep, she tried to wake him up, and he promptly went back to sleep. Great effort, Dad. By this point in my life, I was a night owl. I'd stay up until late to watch Adult Swim and chill with my dog. And one night, at about 1:30, I was sitting in my room doing just that. Suddenly, Jeffrey had this deep, menacing rumble coming from him. He'd been with us for a while by that time, and I'd never heard anything like it. I asked him what was up, and he just carried on with this alien noise, staring dead center at one of my windows as if he could see through the damn thing. The blinds were drawn, so I sat silently freaking out, imagining what was on the other side of that wall, and why it was making my dog do this. Not 1 minute later, I heard my mom scream at the top of her lungs, and I quote, "What the fuck? Yeah, I've seen you now, fucker!" Time pretty much stopped then and there. I don't know if this was my kid imagination, but I shit you not. In that moment, Jeffrey and I looked at each other, both mouths agape, frozen by what we'd heard. I don't really remember getting up and running through the house to my living room, but I got there just in time to see my sweet little mom fly out of that door with her trusty golf club, chasing this guy down like Usain Bolt chasing the gold. I'd never seen her move so fast. By this time, my dad had decided to wake up enough to come through to take the reins and call the police. Jeff had bolted out the door after my mom, and at one point caught up with her before she stopped at the end of the street. She was screaming anything and everything at this point, from "I'll fucking get you," and "You're fucking done," to just incoherent mess. I watched like a drone as she came back to the house, dog in tow, and I just sat down on the couch, entirely unsure of what the fuck just happened. She took the phone and gave them a perfect description. He'd been walking around the front of the house where she was in the spare room. By this point, we'd installed motion lights. This guy wouldn't let up. Autumn was upon us and leaves were falling, so she heard the crunch outside. She timed it perfectly to get a good look at this guy. She finally saw him pass that window when she happened to be looking out, and his face was flooded with light from the new motion lights situated by the window. Apparently, he heard her when she screamed and paused like a deer caught in the literal headlights and looked dead straight into the window before taking off down the road. It took about 5 minutes for the police to arrive. A few cars had been dispatched, and one of them to us and the rest out to the neighboring streets. 10 minutes later, one of them got a call to say they got him. Soon, he was parked up the street in a cruiser so my mom could identify him, and sure enough, it was him. They grabbed him a few streets from our house.
This is the part that makes my stomach turn. Turns out he wasn't just the persistent klepto we thought we had had on our hands. I was standing by the front door when I heard through one of the police officer's radios, insert the guy's name, registered sex offender. I was a bit naive at this point. I kind of got what it meant, but it wasn't until I was older and was talking to my mom about it that a few more details came out. Unbeknownst to me, my mom was very much aware of what happened with this guy. Turns out, he'd been convicted of raping a 12-year-old girl. I'm not sure how long he was in there, but at some point he managed to get out and then moved to one of the houses a few streets over from us, coincidentally in viewpoint of where I'd get on and off the school bus. He was on parole, so he was promptly thrown back in jail, and this is where my knowledge of him ends, and I've never wanted to pursue knowing anything more. Even worse, one of our family friends that lived on the same street as him had received a letter to say he was registered and staying in her area. I shit you not, we were within a 3-minute walk from their house. We saw this woman so often, we still didn't really know how or why she never thought to bring it up. I mean, she had 2 kids herself. We ended up moving to the UK 2 months later for reasons unrelated. I won't lie, that time was pretty stressful. We didn't feel entirely comfortable in our home anymore, and moving to another country kind of wrecked me at that age. Once we started our new life here, I didn't think much of it after that. I mean, I had bigger issues. This guy was persistent, but he was in jail, and he wasn't going to travel to the UK to get me. I was rational about my fear of him, so I found it easy to move on at that time. I've been thinking about it a lot more the older I've gotten, so I guess this is more a cathartic post than anything else. So, to the pedo that spent a month stalking me and trying to break into my house, let's not meet. Ever. Also, I should mention that my dad was friends with a police officer that happened to be living in the area. He'd been made aware of everything that was going on and knew to look out for us, and the one funny thing to come out of this was that had us all laughing today was that this officer had told my dad he could defend his home with fatal force if anyone actually managed to get in. At the time, my dad had this stupid replica sword he'd bought from the Renaissance Festival and kept it close. I mean, he honestly thought he'd become William Wallace and use this piece of junk to defend his wife and child. I blame his being too chill about the situation on the false sense of heroism that damn sword brought him. I'll take the tiny woman with the golf club any day. Camping in Washington. In September of 2011, I was camping up in the beautiful Cascade Mountains of Washington State with my friend Dave. My name is Dave as well. We got there early on Thursday to get to the spot we wanted to. It was, for us, the start of the Labor Day weekend, and we had set up camp and drove up an old logging road to get our firewood for the night. There's a bridge close to our campsite. We had supper and relaxed around the campfire, and at about 10:30 that night, I decided to grab a flashlight and go looking around the area across the bridge. I really had not planned on looking for Bigfoot, as I was busy with the logistics of putting this camping trip together. I will say, I am a true believer in Sasquatch, and read Bigfoot stories all of the time. As I cleared the bridge, there is a dead-end road on the right that goes down for about a quarter of a mile or so. I know this because I've been down there. The road is gated at the top. In the middle of the gate is a red reflector, and I couldn't see the reflector because something was standing in front of it. I'd shined my regular flashlight with about 3/4 battery power down the road. What did I see? A big pair of yellow eyes looking back at me. I froze. I remember thinking, oh my God. I noticed that the right eye was much brighter than the left eye, and I thought that perhaps there was some hair hanging down over the inside of the left eye, or maybe it had an injury. I then noticed how far apart the eyes were, and how high up from the ground they were. Actually, they were roughly even with mine, but the road there sloped down a bit, about 4 feet or more. I'm 5'8", and this thing would have towered over me. The creature was either dark brown or black, and I couldn't make out any body or head features at all. Just those yellow eyes. There was no odor at all. The air was perfectly still, and this thing made no noise. I processed all of this very quickly. If it would have growled at me, it would have been laundry time. It seemed to kind of be going side to side a little without moving its feet. Then the eyes dropped down a little and made a big circle. Then another circle, same as the last, like an owl, only way bigger. I thought maybe he had put his hands on his knees, kind of like I've seen apes on TV do, and it looked at me for about 3 more seconds, and I lost it. Not knowing what this thing was going to do next, I took off running to the middle of the bridge and spun around. Every hair on my body was standing up. It didn't follow me. I wasn't surprised, but I was also very happy. I realized I was panting and sweating, mostly from adrenaline. I hustled back to camp and told Dave what had happened, and I said, "Let's go back over there. Grab your camera." He had a digital one with a strong flash and video and audio capabilities. I was really excited at this point. I knew that if this could be a chance of a lifetime to get this thing on film. You have to understand that in my mind, there was nothing else that this creature could be than a real Sasquatch. I mean, I completely believe that to this day. Anyway, Dave couldn't find his camera, and after he looked for a few minutes, I got pissed and just said, "Let's go while this thing is still in the same county." So we get to the bridge and walk very fast at first, and then slow down, trying to be as quiet as we could. I whispered to him, "You watch the left side. I'll watch this side. We'll try to get both the flashlights on it at the same time." Dave had a flashlight that was similar to mine. The thing wasn't in front of the gate anymore, and that really didn't surprise me. But what I did see was the red reflector. I didn't even know it was there the first time, but there it was. If something hadn't been standing there before, it would have stuck out like a sore thumb. It had been blocked by the Bigfoot. On Dave's side was a pullout. It was empty. I told Dave, "Hey, shine your light up the road." And there it was. On my side, walking slowly towards us. He had the exact same eyes. The left one messed up, just like the first time I saw him. Dave and I were about 10 or 12 feet apart, and I said, "Dave, there he is. Do you see it? Dave, he's coming. There he is." Both of our lights had shined on this thing's face at the same time, only for like 3 seconds or so, but it lit his head up. The head did not look pointed, like many people have reported, but it was big. I was slowly backing up as I watched it walking towards us. "Don't you see it?" I said. Dave said, "No." I had no idea how he couldn't have seen this thing. Again, I was backing up slowly out of fear, but I was watching those eyes move up and down rhythmically. Well, it turns out that Dave can't see much in bright sunlight, and at night he is basically following the sound of your voice. So he couldn't find his camera at the critical time, and I have no witnesses to this incident, even though he was right there with me. I mean, I love the guy, but fuck. So I get scared and take off running to the middle of the bridge again, with Dave right behind me. And the only reason he's running is because I was. You ever hear the joke about never going grizzly bear hunting with a friend who can outrun you? Well, I outweighed Dave, and he had trouble keeping up. Also, although the road was going uphill, it was very straight and flat. I was familiar with this stretch of road, having camped there many times. This gave me a great idea of how tall this thing actually was. When I say it was pushing 10 feet tall, I feel confident that this is an accurate judgment of its true height, and there were no tree branches there at all to justify an owl sitting on a limb. If it was an owl, it would have had to have been 10 feet tall. We quickly got back to camp, and Dave, of course, then finds his camera. It was under his sleeping bag. We jumped into our van and shot across the bridge. Of course, we couldn't find the thing, and it was gone. I knew that he was just inside the trees on one side or the other, but it was as dark as the inside of a buffalo on a moonless night. The next morning, I walked across the bridge to the top of the road on the right. I walked up to the gate and stood there, right exactly where he stood. I paced it off, and it was roughly 45 yards to where I stood when I first spotted him. I'll tell you this, I'm bringing a massive flashlight the next time I go out there, and have a camera ready as well. But, you get your chances when they happen, and I just was not prepared. One thing I haven't mentioned. At the time all this happened, I had totally forgotten that in my tent were my 2 guns. I had my 9mm pistol, plus a 12-gauge sawed-off double-barreled shotgun, side by side and barely legal.
That thing was loaded with double-aught buckshot, but it had never occurred to me to shoot this guy. I had completely forgotten that I was heavily armed, and when he was walking down the road towards us, in retrospect, he was just kind of shooing us away, I think. I think of him as being a gentle giant, and he very easily could have run us down and killed us. I feel blessed that they are out there, and that this one did not harass or threaten us in any way, other than just leisurely walking towards us and scaring the crap out of me. I plan on going back out there, but more prepared this time. This encounter was truly terrifying, even though it doesn't sound like it was, and he didn't hurt us. But we were both scared. Even our big German shepherd knew something was wrong. Hopefully all three of us will go back and see him again. My grandparents' haunted house, submitted by Tom219. I'll start off with a little backstory. This takes place in a small town in Indiana. I've always thought my grandparents' house was haunted. It was a big old house with a small pond in the back. It wasn't in the middle of nowhere like a lot of haunted house stories you might hear, but it was the biggest house on the street. I'm not sure how often it is to move an entire house to a different plot of land, but originally my grandparents' house was located somewhere else in town. As little kids, my cousins and I would often tell ghost stories in the basement. A few times, we thought we saw and heard things, but it might have been our young imaginations. My grandma was very religious. She said the rosary every day, and her and my grandpa went to church every Sunday, and they had crosses and religious pictures all over the house. That's the main reason why I think the activity wasn't as active while they were still alive. After they passed away in 2010 and 2011, exactly 6 months to the day, my family and I started to clean out the house. The house was now in my mom's name, although nobody lived there. I would go there every few weeks to cut the grass, and with it being a good-sized yard, I would go inside and take a break halfway through. The only furniture left was a couch, a TV, and pictures on the wall. In one instance, I was sitting on the couch without the TV on, just texting someone, when all of a sudden, a picture of Jesus hanging on the wall on the other side of the room just fell off the wall and shattered everywhere. It scared the shit out of me. The odd thing about it was that it fell straight down, but the nail was still sticking out of the wall. The next incident happened a month later when I was there taking a break again from cutting the grass. I was watching TV, but the volume was really low, and then I heard pounding coming from upstairs in the hallway. It was a very narrow hallway, and it sounded like somebody was walking down it very slowly, banging the walls really hard with their fists on both sides. At first, I didn't think anything paranormal. I thought somebody had broken in. After a minute of staring at the bottom of the staircase, I finally worked up enough courage to go up there and check it out. I grabbed my small pocket knife from my waist and walked up there slowly, and since it's an old house, almost every step creaked, making it even more scary and intense. For this being a big house, the upstairs is very small, although the upstairs has 5 rooms, but again, each of them is small. I checked room by room, including every closet, but nobody was there. The upstairs had already been completely cleared out, and there was no furniture or anything at all, so there would be absolutely no place to hide. The last memorable incident happened maybe a few months later when my Uncle James and I were cleaning out the last few things from the basement, a refrigerator and a deep freezer. After we got the refrigerator up the stairs and out, we came back in, locked the door, and went back into the basement. There's an old sink down there, and under it we found a box that belonged to one of my other uncles from years ago, so we started looking through it. It was filled with concert ticket stubs, old newspaper clippings, and things like that. Then my Uncle James put his finger up in front of his lips and said, "Shh," and he pointed upward. We both looked up and heard footsteps in the kitchen, like someone was trying to be quiet. You could tell exactly where they stepped because a little bit of dust would fall from the ceiling with each step. My uncle grabbed a weapon, I think it might have been a hammer, and I grabbed a sledgehammer, and we tiptoed to the bottom of the staircase. The way the house is set up is after you walk past the kitchen is the basement stairs. As we were looking up the staircase, we could still hear the light footsteps in the kitchen.
My uncle looked at me and whispered, "On the count of 3, we run up there." I shook my head as he counted to 3 on his fingers. We ran up into the kitchen, and to our surprise, nobody was there. We checked the front and back doors, and they were both locked. We then searched the entire house and found nothing. I know for a fact that something or somebody was in the kitchen because it was so obvious with the footsteps and dust falling with each step.
Thing at Devil's Bridge, submitted by Lonnie. Okay, first off, this was a crazy night. It happened in a town called Kirby Lonsdale, which is in Cumbria, about 80 kilometers or so north of Manchester, England. I was living in a flat with my mate Aaron and working at a local pub, and that's where this whole thing started. There's a fairly famous spot right outside of town called the Devil's Bridge, and people from all over the place come to take pictures of it and all that rot. I grew up here, so it's never been a big thing, but it's a draw for a lot of other people. When I was a lad, we used to tombstone it into the river, which was frowned upon, and there are bylaws against it now. The police chased us once, but they don't really enforce it, and people stop when they come around anyway. So one night in the spring of 2000, I was having a pint and a bite with some friends at the place I was working at when I had a night off, which was rare. I worked almost 7 days a week back then and loved being in the place. It was getting late and almost time to close up, but there were some touristy people still nursing their drinks, and they were staying the night, so we didn't just want to give them the boot. They were Yanks, about my age. I was around 22 at the time, and one guy was totally arseholed and making a fuss of everything. They had gotten in late and were supposed to see the bridge in the daylight, but ended up checking in and staying in the tavern as it had started raining. He was moaning about not seeing the bridge, and they were moving on in the morning. I assured him it wasn't that big of a deal, and that they could check it out in the morn, and it would be just as spectacular as then as ever. Somehow we got to talking about how we used to jump off the bridge, we called it tombstoning, and we all had a laugh about being stupid kids. Drunk guy, I'll call him David to save him embarrassment, started saying he wanted to do that too, and I laughed and I told him it was against the law and kind of dangerous. But he kept on saying he wanted to do it, and then he started offering money if we went out there right then and there. His mates tried to calm him down as he got louder and louder and insisted on going to the bridge right then, even if he couldn't jump. He offered me a $5 to take them, and I said, "No, just wait for the morn." But he kept offering more. Wait, the guy is drunk, his friends aren't far behind him, and they get up to like 20 pounds or so I shake my head, and I tell my friend I'll call Patrick. I'll split it with him if we went out there together to take these guys. It wasn't a far walk, but it was dark and rainy, and while I knew I was taking advantage of these guys, I still did it. We got out there after our short trip, and I remember saying, "Here it is, it's just a bridge." David first looked over to the side and saw that it's about 13 or 15 meters down to the water, and his idea to jump ended right there. He did, however, insist on going down near the water to look back at the bridge, even though it was dark. So I told him to follow me, and I got them all down. We were down on a grassy side, and I'm thinking, ho-hum, but hey, I just made a tenner for doing nothing, and that's when one of the other guys, I'll call him John, says, "What is that?" He was pointing across the river at something on the rocks, and it took me a minute to see what it was. I can only describe it as this thing. For a second, I thought it was just someone pissing around, but the more we all looked at it, we realized it was real, and it was not a human. It was about my height, just under 2 meters, and it was covered in dark hair. Again, it was night, it was across the river, it was drizzling, but this thing was there, looking at something in the rocks. "What the hell is that?" whispered David, and I told him, "I don't really know." My mates looked at each other and were saying the same thing. What the hell was going on? The thing kept doddering about the rocks, and to this day we all think it was looking for something to eat, mice or what have you. One of the Yanks picked up a rock and threw it toward the thing before anyone could tell him to stop, and the splash got the thing's attention, and it looked around, and then it looked at our little group. I could see it sort of bend its head forward, like it was trying to get a better look at us, and that's when I realized we were in danger. Now, I'm not saying this was Bigfoot, and there's not a lot of stories about Bigfoot around here, and in all the stories and things I've looked at later after this happened, I've never heard of one being dangerous or whatever, in like some of the movies I've seen. But this thing got mad. It let out this growl-like howl and kept staring at us. I said we should go, and the moment we turned, this thing jumped into the water at us, and before we even got all the way up the bank, it was already on our side and running up at us. We booked it across the bridge back towards town, and whatever this thing was right behind us. I was the last of the group. I'm not that fast, sorry. And I could hear it breathing and the slapping of its footsteps on the tarmac. I look back now and think that it didn't really want to catch up with us. It just wanted to chase us away for some reason. I can't really say. It let out another growl-like howl as we ran back to the main road and into town. As soon as we got to the streetlights of the roadway, I looked back and saw it standing a ways back, just staring at us. Everyone else had stopped too, and we all looked at it for at least a full minute before it howled again and then ran into the fields. We got back to the tavern, and I used my key to get into the back and got everyone a brandy at the bar. It's something my dad always told me to do to get people to calm down. No one spoke all the way back to the pub, but now everyone was bristling with chatter about what had just happened. I told the Yanks my mates had never heard or seen anything like that before, and we all talked about what the heck it could have been. David was sure it was a Bigfoot, but it just seemed impossible to me. Then the phone rang, and it was my boss wondering why the lights were on, and I told him the whole story. He just laughed, told us we were off our trolley, and said finish up quick and get the guests to where they needed to be, and that he thought we saw something that came out of a few too many pints. I did just that, and then got myself home to bed. I have to admit, on my solo walk back to my flat, I was more than nervous and scared, always looking over my shoulder. Maybe that thing had followed me into town. In the morning when I went back, the guys were gone, and I never saw or heard that thing again. Neither has anyone else I've asked or told the story to. David found me on MySpace years after this happened, and the last thing he said to me was, "What the hell was that thing?" That was a little more scary than jumping off a bridge. I have to agree with him. My Old House, submitted by Old Troll. One Saturday afternoon, my husband had taken my son swimming, and I took my daughter to the cinema. We all met up in town after and then ate out. That night, at about 11:30-ish, Gray and I were chilling, watching a really cheesy Horror of the Cats, I think it was called. Anyway, halfway through, the phone rang. I answered to a man's voice, saying he was returning a phone call from our number. He said he was a gas plumber and apologized for calling late, but he had only just got in and thought it was best to call now as it might have been an urgent call. I told him that we had not called any plumber, and my husband could do any jobs like this as it was his trade. The caller apologized and said the call from our number was at 3:30 p.m. that day. No message, but caller ID showed our number. Now, odd as it might sound, I felt I knew his voice. His voice sounded like an old friend John from our teens. Then I recalled John was a plumber now, so I just asked, "Is this John so-and-so?" And he said yes. I said, "It's Babs." Don't laugh, that's my nickname. John went quiet and then said, "I've just moved house and saw you pass the other day. You were heading up the hill and went into the first house. Is that where you live now?" Turns out, John only lived a few doors down the road from me now. Though John was certain about the call from my number, I explained we were all out that afternoon, and we couldn't have called. But what a coincidence, and we agreed it was really odd to have that kind of thing happen. About 6 months on, we all came back from grocery shopping, and there was a missed call on our monitor. No message. So, as my husband was in the building trades, I thought best to call back in case it was a potential customer. What I got was a man's voice saying that he had been returning our call from around 1:30 p.m. I know this will sound unbelievable, but it's the truth. I have nothing to gain by lying, but I recognized the voice. Not John this time, but Benny, another old friend from my teens, also a plumber. I asked him if that was his name, and he said yes, and I told him we hadn't called, and told him what had happened with John. Benny knew John from back in the day, and I explained that there was no way we had either of their numbers, and told him I was pretty freaked out by all of this. The first time was really odd, but twice? We chatted a while and caught up, and then I put it down to just being weird. Another year on, and I divorced and money was tight. Hands up to not paying the phone bill, so they put me on incoming calls only until I paid up. So for a while I couldn't make calls, but could receive them. About 4 p.m. one afternoon, my daughter and I were sitting watching TV when the phone rang. I answered to what sounded like a teenage boy, and he said he was returning a call from my number that had come about a half hour earlier. I told him that no one had used the phone, and the only people in all afternoon were sitting together in the same room as the phone. I didn't fancy having to tell a stranger that I hadn't paid my bill and was stuck on incoming calls only. The boy on the phone said he had been out, and when the phone rang, his older brother had answered, and a young teenage boy had told him to call back. The brother was confused, and the caller hung up, so the older lad told his brother when he got in that it must have been one of his mates. I shuddered. Not only had my phone called someone else again, but this time there was a voice involved. I really wanted to ask this lad more, but of course it wouldn't have been right. So I can already tell that he was unnerved as to what was going on, and I told him straight out that our phone was on incoming calls only, and so it was not possible to make a call from my number. I wondered after whether there was a connection with the last call to someone else I used to know, but I guess I'll never find out. Home Alone, submitted by Sweet1453. Growing up in the country was a lot of fun on my family farm, but there was one time something terrified me that I'll never forget. My family's place was outside of La Crosse, Kansas, and if you don't know where that is, I don't blame you. It's right in the middle of the state and really in the middle of nowhere. My father and grandfather ran a wheat and corn farm, but we also had some animals that we usually grew for extra food, to butcher ourselves too. Chickens, some cows, and pigs. When I was 16 and my sister was 12, my grandpa died unexpectedly, and it was a very tough time in our family. We had to hire some new hands, which worked out well, but it kind of opened my father's eyes to how he was living his life and never taking time out to actually live. If you don't know, farming is not an easy life. It's a lot of time, and it's a lot of hard work. My mother finally convinced him to take some time off. It was winter, and she told him to go visit my uncle in California and just relax. She would stay home with us and give him some time to just be by himself and figure things out. He did, and that first Saturday night while he was gone, my mom was asked by a friend to go to the movies in Great Bend, which was like 45 minutes away. She then asked me to watch my sister, and I said okay. And for two teenage girls, we got along pretty well, and I promised her movie night at home with popcorn and everything. My mom was planning on eating at a restaurant after the movie, so I put my cooking skills to work and made TV dinners when she left. Yeah, I was a heck of a chef. Everything was going great, but at about 8 p.m., I went to get refills on our Cokes and happened to look out of our kitchen window into the backyard. We had a large barn out there with a floodlight that automatically came on with any movement in the yard, and I was standing there, and it did just that. Standing next to the barn was a shape of a man, a big man. He didn't do anything. He was just standing there, but he must have moved a little to get the light to go on above him. I was in the dark of the house, so I'm positive he couldn't see me, but right away I knew something was wrong. I stood there waiting to see if he would move, thinking maybe it was one of my dad's friends over to borrow something. But that couldn't be. My mother would have told me if that was going to happen. After about 5 minutes, the light turned off and I could still sort of see the man, but after another minute or so, he just kind of walked backwards into the dark and was gone. I'll admit, I was a little spooked, but figured maybe it was someone who was lost. I mean, why they were way out here, I didn't even think about that. Which should have tipped me off that something was very wrong, as our closest neighbor is about 2 miles away, and there was nothing behind our house except the fields for our crops. Being a naive kid, I got 2 more Cokes and just went back to the living room. My sister and I finished one of our movies, and while I was rewinding the tape, my sister went to use the bathroom. A couple of minutes later, I heard her yell down to me that there was a man outside, and I ran back to the kitchen. Sure enough, the same figure was standing in the light of the barn. This time he was a little closer, and I could see he was wearing a heavy coat and hat. I stayed low in the window watching him, but again the light went out and he went back to the dark behind the barn. Just then my sister came up behind me and I gave out a shriek and then punched her, telling her to never sneak up on me again like that, little brat. She was worried, and I told her that it was strange, but maybe it was just someone lost, and if he came back, I'd yell out to him to see what he wanted. My sister wanted me to get the gun. I'd been shooting since I was 9, and I told her to settle down. We stood there in the dark, and just a bit later the light came on from outside again, and there was the man, now walking towards the house. He stopped about halfway between the house and the barn this time, and now the light was behind him, so I couldn't make out who it was. I told my sister to run and get one of the shotguns with some shells, and she was back in record time. I opened the back door slowly. "Who are you, and what are you doing out there?" I called, feeling brave with my shotgun in my arms. The man said nothing. He just stood there. I asked again what he was doing, but it was the same. "You'd better get going on before I wake up my dad," I said, lying, but not wanting him to know it was just us two home alone. The light went out, and I saw him walking back to the barn in the dark again before the light clicked back on. I went back inside, told my sister to call the police, and then made sure all the doors and windows were locked. I took the phone from her and told the police what was going on, and that we were sure it wasn't a friend of the family. They said they'd be out as soon as they could, and to just stay put until then. I hung up, and then we waited to see what was going to happen. And again, sure enough, the light came on, and there he was, walking even closer to the house, but this time he kept on going around to the side of the house and out of our view of the back window. We ran back into the living room and saw lights coming up the drive, and it was the police. An officer got out of his truck and came up to the porch, and I opened the door as we talked over one another, trying to tell him what happened. He calmed us down a bit, and then said he was going to look around and for us to just stay inside. About 10 minutes later, he knocked on the door again, and we let him in. He hadn't found anything, and he thought we probably scared him off for good when he pulled up into the driveway. We thanked him, and he said to call again if something else happened, and that he'd drive by again later on just to make sure that we were safe. Nothing else happened, but we were still pretty scared. It was about 11:30 when my mom should have been getting home when we heard glass break on the side door, and I looked into a mirror that was propped so I could see the side door without leaving the living room. A hand was reaching in for the locks, and I screamed for my sister to call the police again, and I yelled out that I had a gun. My sister was screaming into the phone, and the door opened, and in stepped this man I'd never seen before. I pointed the gun at him, and he stopped and stared at me and just looked at the gun. I screamed at him to leave, and the police were coming, and he turned and walked out, and then started running out to the back of our property. The police weren't that far away, and they came flying up our driveway, and the policeman got out of his truck and started yelling at the man who was still creeping around our barn. 2 other sheriff cars also pulled up, and they surrounded the guy, caught him, and arrested him. Not long after, my mom pulled up, saw the police cars, and was hysterical that something happened to us, and between all of us, we told her what had happened. The guy was some drifter who had overheard my dad talking to someone in town that he was going out of town, and that it would just be us ladies at home. When they caught him behind the barn, he was trying to hide a pistol, and he had ropes and tape in a plastic bag that he had left outside of the house. They took him away, and my parents did a bunch of legal things to make sure he would never come back, but that was a scary night. My mom beat herself up for years for not being home with us, but my dad said I did the right thing by getting the shotgun out and letting the guy know I had it. I've got kids of my own now, and every time I leave them alone, I think of that night. I know I can't live my life in fear, and I don't, and my kids are great on their own, but I still think about it.
Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you've got a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear narrated on this channel or my podcast, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you haven't subscribed to this channel, hey, why not? If you have the time, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment in the section below. I'd love to hear what you think of the stories. Follow me on social media, there's links to that in the description. And if you'd like to take your support of the channel a step further, find a link to my Patreon page down there, or consider purchasing some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. There's a link to my TeePublic storefront down there. All those cool designs make really great holiday gifts. And speaking of the holidays, if you've got a cool Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, New Year's story, send it my way. I will be putting together a holiday special as usual. Would love to have your story. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.